August 19, 1960, Washington District of Columbia. Arthur Lundahl's hands trembled slightly as he lifted the first photograph from the sealed canister. 20 pounds of film had just returned from space, plucked from the sky by a cargo plane over the Pacific Ocean. As the CIA's chief photo interpreter, he had spent years analyzing every scrap of intelligence about Soviet military capabilities. Now, in this windowless room, he held something that would change everything. The photograph showed 8 broad swaths running north to south across the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. In a single mission, this satellite had photographed more territory than all 24 U-2 reconnaissance flights combined. The image quality was grainy, fogged in places by electrical discharges, but unmistakable. And as Lundahl studied the vast emptiness where hundreds of missile sites should have been, he understood that the greatest threat facing America might be built entirely on lies. The Cold War's most consequential deception was about to unravel, not through spies or defectors, but through the cold mathematics of orbital photography. The Soviets had bragged about endless missiles rolling off assembly lines like sausages. One satellite had just proven them wrong. The path to this moment began 3 years earlier, when American intelligence faced its darkest hour. Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev stood before the world in January 1957, declaring that his nation possessed intercontinental ballistic missiles capable of reaching any part of the globe. In November 1958, Moscow announced it had begun serial production of ICBMs. The United States, caught in the grip of fear following the Sputnik launch in October 1957, had no way to verify these claims. The intelligence estimates grew more alarming with each passing month. In December 1957, National Intelligence Estimate 111057 predicted the Soviets would probably have up to 10 prototype ICBMs operational between mid-1958 and mid-1959. This relatively cautious assessment would not survive the winter. By August 1958, just 8 months later, NIE 11558 concluded that the USSR had the technical and industrial capability to have 100 operational ICBMs by 1960. The projection for 1961 climbed to 500 missiles. Some estimates reached as high as 800 ICBMs by mid-1963. The American public absorbed these numbers with growing dread. Senator John Kennedy, preparing for his presidential campaign, seized upon the issue with calculated precision. On August 14, 1958, he declared that the nation could afford the steps necessary to close the missile gap. The term itself entered the American vocabulary, a 2-word summary of perceived Soviet superiority and American vulnerability. But Kennedy's rhetoric, however politically effective, rested on estimates that bore little relationship to reality. Inside the intelligence community, doubts had already begun to surface. The Central Intelligence Agency, analyzing data from U-2 reconnaissance flights, placed Soviet ICBM numbers far lower than Air Force estimates. The problem was proof. Without comprehensive photographic coverage of Soviet territory, no one could say with certainty how many missiles existed. The U-2 aircraft, flying at 70,000 feet above Soviet airspace, had provided the first real glimpse behind the Iron Curtain. Beginning July 4, 1956, these high-altitude reconnaissance missions had mapped Soviet military installations with unprecedented detail, but the flights covered only narrow corridors, missing vast expanses of Soviet territory. In 4 years of operations, U-2 pilots had failed to locate a single operational ICBM base. On May 1, 1960, the program ended in disaster. Soviet air defenses shot down a U-2 near Sverdlovsk, capturing its pilot, Francis Gary Powers. President Dwight Eisenhower, facing international humiliation, halted all U-2 overflights of the Soviet Union. The small crack in Soviet secrecy slammed shut. America's intelligence agencies were blind precisely when they needed vision most. The solution had been in development since 1956, born from a classified program designated WS-117L. The goal seemed almost impossible. Launch a camera into orbit, photograph specific targets from 100 miles above Earth, return the film to the planet in a heat-resistant capsule, snatch that capsule from the sky with an aircraft, develop the film, and extract intelligence that could guide national policy. The Air Force disguised the program as Discoverer, a scientific research project exploring space conditions. The public watched these launches from Vandenberg Air Force Base in California, unaware they were witnessing the birth of satellite reconnaissance. Behind the classified walls of Lockheed's facility in Palo Alto, engineers wrestled with problems no one had solved before. The camera system itself represented a technological marvel that pushed the boundaries of optical engineering. A panoramic lens scanned back and forth perpendicular to the satellite's orbital path, exposing film at right angles to the direction of flight. The camera's focal length measured 24 inches, large enough to achieve ground resolution between 35 and 40 feet from an altitude exceeding 100 miles. At that distance, the system could distinguish objects the size of small buildings, but not individual vehicles. Fairchild Camera and Instrument Corporation designed and built the main camera assembly. Engineers faced unprecedented challenges. The camera had to function in the vacuum of space, where conventional lubricants evaporated and moving parts seized. It needed to operate in temperature extremes, ranging from minus 150 degrees Fahrenheit in Earth's shadow to plus 200 degrees Fahrenheit in direct sunlight. It had to withstand the violent vibrations of launch, the vacuum of space, and exposure to cosmic radiation. The film itself required special development. Kodak produced a high-resolution emulsion that could survive space conditions without degradation. The film needed sensitivity across a broad spectrum to capture ground detail through atmospheric haze. It needed physical strength to withstand rapid transport through the camera mechanism. It needed storage stability to remain viable for mission durations, lasting days or weeks. 31,500 feet of 70mm film loaded into each mission capsule, stored on precision reels in a controlled environment. The film magazines included heating elements to prevent the emulsion from becoming brittle in space's cold. Pressure vessels maintained enough atmosphere around the film to prevent outgassing in vacuum. Every component was tested extensively in thermal vacuum chambers that simulated space conditions. But getting the film back to Earth proved far more challenging than taking the photographs. Each satellite carried a General Electric return vehicle weighing approximately 300 pounds fully loaded. The conical capsule measured 30 inches in diameter and 40 inches long. Its heat shield consisted of reinforced plastic capable of withstanding re-entry temperatures exceeding 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit. The return sequence required split-second precision. At mission's end, ground controllers transmitted commands to the satellite's onboard systems. A small solid-fuel retro motor fired, producing exactly enough thrust to slow the capsule by the calculated amount. Too little thrust and the capsule would remain in orbit. Too much, and it would enter the atmosphere too steeply, burning up from excessive heating. After separation from the Agena stage, the capsule's protective nose cone jettisoned, exposing the parachute compartment. At 60,000 feet altitude, a barometric sensor triggered parachute deployment. A small drogue chute deployed first, stabilizing the capsule's descent. At 14,000 feet, the main parachute unfurled, a red and white canopy 40 feet in diameter, designed to slow the capsule to survivable descent rates. Specially equipped C-119 flying boxcar aircraft, based at Hickam Air Force Base in Hawaii, waited in designated recovery zones. Each aircraft carried a trapeze assembly extending from its cargo bay, equipped with hooks designed to snag parachute lines during mid-air passes. Pilots practiced the maneuver repeatedly, learning to judge closure rates, wind drift, and parachute oscillation. The recovery window lasted only about 30 minutes as the capsule descended through the atmosphere. If aircraft missed the capsule, Navy ships steamed toward the splashdown point, ready to retrieve it from the ocean before salt water could damage the film. But ocean recovery was a last resort. The film needed rapid processing to provide timely intelligence, and shipboard recovery could take days to return the capsule to processing facilities. Captain Harold Mitchell and his crew aboard the C-119 call sign Pelican 9 made the first successful aerial recovery on August 19, 1960. Flying at 250 miles per hour at 8,000 feet altitude, Mitchell positioned his aircraft below the descending capsule. On the third pass, The trapeze hooks snagged the parachute shroud lines. The capsule jerked upward momentarily as the aircraft absorbed the weight, then settled into stable tow beneath the aircraft. The crew winched it aboard and sealed it in protective containers. Within hours, it was on its way to Washington. That single capsule, designated Corona Mission 14, contained 9.1 kilograms of exposed film, representing 1 day of orbital photography. The film reached secure processing facilities under armed guard. Technicians developed it using procedures that balanced speed with image quality. Within 24 hours of landing, the first prints reached photointerpreters in Washington. The first mission launched February 28, 1959. The satellite reached orbit successfully, but the return vehicle's timer failed. The capsule never separated. Discoverer 1 burned up on re-entry. Its film lost forever. Discoverer 2 launched April 13, 1959. This time the separation worked, but the capsule came down on the wrong side of the planet, landing somewhere in the Norwegian archipelago. If Soviet agents recovered it, they never announced the find. More likely, it simply sank into Arctic waters. The failures continued with grinding inevitability. Discoverer 3 and 4 never reached proper orbits due to inadequate thrust from their Agena engines. Discoverer 5 and 6, launched in August 1959, experienced camera and subsystem failures. The program was grounded for testing and modifications. President Eisenhower and CIA Director Allen Dulles began asking pointed questions. Billions of dollars were flowing into missile programs based on estimates that no one could verify. The intelligence community was divided. Air Force Major General James Walsh predicted the Soviets would have 50 ICBMs by mid-1960, 250 by mid-1961, 500 by mid-1962, and 800 by mid-1963. The CIA, more conservative, suggested numbers closer to a few dozen. Without photographic evidence, both estimates were essentially educated guesses. The political pressure intensified as the 1960 presidential campaign gained momentum. Kennedy hammered the missile gap theme relentlessly. In a Senate floor speech on February 29, 1960, he warned that for the first time since the War of 1812, foreign enemy forces potentially had become a direct and unmistakable threat to the continental United States. The rhetoric was powerful, the imagery vivid, the numbers completely unverifiable. Back at Vandenberg, the Discoverer program resumed launches in February 1960. Discoverer 9 and 10 both failed, adding to a string of 13 consecutive mission failures. Engineers identified problems with re-entry temperatures, subsystem reliability, and camera performance. Each failure led to modifications, but nothing seemed to work. The urgency reached critical levels after the Powers shootdown. Without U-2 flights, American intelligence was operating blind. Khrushchev, sensing American uncertainty, amplified his boasts. In a meeting with Senator Hubert Humphrey in December 1958, the Soviet premier had claimed possession of a new rocket capable of delivering enormous warheads. These pronouncements, impossible to verify or refute, fed American fears and Soviet confidence in equal measure. Then came Discoverer 12 on June 29, 1960. The horizon sensor malfunctioned, putting the spacecraft in the wrong position during separation. Another failure. The pressure on the Corona team was enormous. A competing program called Samos was nearing its first flight. If Corona could not produce results soon, the program might be cancelled entirely. Engineers made a critical change, switching from hot gas spin rockets to cold gas systems. The hot gas rockets, they suspected, were causing the return vehicle to cartwheel through space instead of spinning like a football. On August 10, 1960, Discoverer 13 lifted off from Vandenberg. This mission carried no camera, just a test capsule to validate the recovery system. The satellite completed 17 orbits. On August 11th, the capsule separated cleanly and began its descent. Navy vessels in the Pacific tracked its parachute as it drifted toward the ocean. Recovery ships reached it just before it sank. For the first time, a man-made object had been recovered from orbit. The capsule now sits in the National Air and Space Museum in Washington, a monument to the first of many breakthroughs. 6 days later, on August 18, 1960, Discoverer 14 launched into polar orbit. This mission carried the full camera package and a complete load of film. For one day, the satellite circled Earth, its panoramic camera scanning Soviet territory. On August 19, after 17 passes around the planet, the capsule ejected over Alaska. Retro-rockets fired. The capsule began its fall toward the Pacific. 360 miles southwest of Honolulu, the crew of a C-119 flying boxcar spotted the parachute at 8,000 feet altitude. Captain Harold Mitchell piloted the aircraft through 3 passes. On the third attempt, a trapeze hook snagged the parachute lines. The capsule, containing 9.1 kilograms of film, was secured. The age of satellite reconnaissance had begun. The film reached Washington within 24 hours. Processing revealed images covering more than 1,650,000 square miles of Soviet and Eastern European territory. The resolution, though degraded by electrostatic fogging in places, ranged from 20 to 30 feet. Analysts described the quality as good to very good. More importantly, the coverage exceeded everything the U-2 program had achieved in 4 years of operations. Arthur Lundahl gathered his photo interpreters to show them the images. He showed them a map of the Soviet Union with the narrow lines of U-2 photography, then revealed the broad swaths captured by Discoverer 14. The room erupted in cheers. This was the breakthrough they had desperately needed. The analysts began their painstaking work, examining every frame for signs of ICBM installations. The Soviet R-7 missile, known to Western intelligence, was enormous. Its launch facilities required extensive infrastructure, large gantries, propellant storage, support buildings. Such installations would be clearly visible in satellite photographs. Day after day, the photo interpreters searched. They examined suspected sites identified by other intelligence sources. They scanned areas with suitable terrain and transportation infrastructure. They looked for the telltale signatures of missile complexes, construction activity, security perimeters. And they found nothing. No vast missile fields, no hundreds of launch sites, no evidence of the massive ICBM force that supposedly threatened American cities. The implications were staggering. Either the Soviets had hidden their missiles with impossible perfection, or the missiles simply did not exist in the numbers claimed. Additional Discoverer missions in the following months confirmed the initial findings. Mission after mission returned photographs of empty terrain where intelligence estimates had predicted missile bases. By late 1960, CIA photo interpreters had reached a preliminary conclusion. The Soviets possessed a handful of prototype ICBMs, perhaps 10 or fewer operational missiles. The massive force predicted by Air Force intelligence was a fiction. The missile gap existed, but it favored the United States, not the Soviet Union. President Eisenhower, who had known the truth from U-2 photography before the Powers shootdown, found vindication in the satellite data. But political realities prevented public disclosure. Revealing the satellite program's existence would compromise future intelligence gathering. The presidential campaign continued, with Kennedy attacking supposed American weakness, while Eisenhower, bound by secrecy, could not refute the charges with hard evidence. The 1960 election brought Kennedy to the White House on a platform that included closing the non-existent missile gap. His new Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, arrived at the Pentagon in January 1961, believing firmly in Soviet missile superiority. McNamara had been leaked inflated Air Force estimates by Senator Stuart Symington, former Secretary of the Air Force. These estimates showed hundreds of Soviet missiles threatening American security. Within days of taking office, McNamara and his deputy Roswell Gilpatrick requested access to the Corona satellite photographs. The imagery was shown to them in a secure facility. The Soviet R-7 missile launchers were massive structures, impossible to hide. McNamara and Gilpatrick examined photograph after photograph. The launchers did not appear in any of them. In February 1961, McNamara held a background briefing with Pentagon correspondents. He explained that merely counting missiles was not the way to assess strategic balance. He noted that there were no signs of a Soviet crash effort to build ICBMs. Then he stated plainly that there was no missile gap. The room emptied as reporters raced to break the news. The political fallout was immediate and intense. Kennedy had campaigned on the missile gap for 2 years. Now, 3 weeks into his presidency, his own defense secretary was declaring it non-existent. Press Secretary Pierre Salinger scrambled to contain the damage, claiming the newspaper stories were absolutely wrong. Kennedy himself suggested that no definitive conclusion could be reached until a comprehensive defense review was completed. But the truth could not be suppressed indefinitely. Corona missions continued throughout 1961, each one adding more photographic coverage. By September 1961, a national intelligence estimate concluded that the USSR possessed no more than 25 ICBMs and would not possess significantly more in the near future. The actual number, historians would later learn, was closer to 4 operational missiles. The missile gap had been a myth from the beginning. Soviet missile production, despite Khrushchev's bombastic claims, had proceeded at a deliberate pace. The R-7 missile, while a technological achievement, was wildly impractical for military use. It required hours to fuel, with highly corrosive and volatile propellants that had to be drained every 30 days to prevent explosions. The launch facilities were enormous and vulnerable. As a weapons system, it was nearly useless. The Soviets had focused their resources on medium-range and intermediate-range missiles that could threaten Western Europe, but not the United States. This explained their later decision to place missiles in Cuba, an attempt to compensate for their strategic weakness vis-à-vis America. The entire Cuban Missile Crisis of October 1962 stemmed partly from Soviet awareness that they were far behind in ICBMs. Khrushchev's deception had multiple motivations rooted in Soviet strategic weakness and domestic political calculations. He needed to project strength while cutting conventional military forces to save money for consumer goods that Soviet citizens desperately needed. After visiting the United States in September 1959, Khrushchev had recognized how far behind Soviet living standards lagged. American supermarkets astounded him. The abundance of consumer goods available to ordinary Americans contrasted starkly with chronic shortages in Soviet stores. Upon returning to Moscow, Khrushchev made a calculated gamble. He would cut hundreds of thousands of troops from Soviet conventional forces, redirecting that spending toward consumer goods and agriculture. To compensate for reduced military manpower, he would emphasize nuclear missiles as the ultimate deterrent, but Soviet missile technology was primitive and unreliable. The R-7 ICBM, while a propaganda triumph after launching Sputnik, was virtually worthless as a weapon. The missile required a massive concrete launch pad. Its cryogenic fuel boiled away constantly, requiring immediate fueling before launch. The process took hours, and once fueled, the missile could only remain on the pad briefly before corrosive propellants damaged critical systems. It could not be stored ready to fire. Soviet rocket designer Sergei Korolev had built the R-7 to deliver primitive Soviet nuclear warheads across intercontinental distances. Early Soviet weapons were enormous because Soviet physicists lagged behind American miniaturization. Only 4 of these missiles ever deployed to operational sites at Plesetsk, 600 miles north of Moscow. They stood as symbols of technological achievement, not practical weapons. Their extensive launch facilities meant American satellites could not possibly miss them if hundreds existed. Khrushchev needed to intimidate Western Europe and the United States, while convincing the Communist Party leadership that his military reorganization made sense. The boasts served these purposes brilliantly. When he declared missiles were rolling off production lines like sausages, he created international credibility for non-existent capabilities. Western intelligence agencies, unable to penetrate Soviet secrecy, assumed the worst. The Soviet leader's personality suited this strategy perfectly. Khrushchev pounded his shoe on a desk at the United Nations to emphasize Soviet power. He made crude threats and grandiose promises. Western leaders often misread his bombast as confidence, backed by genuine capability. In reality, Khrushchev understood Soviet weakness acutely. When Corona satellites began orbiting overhead in mid-1960, Khrushchev faced a new vulnerability. The Americans could now see everything. Soviet air defenses could not reach satellites orbiting at 100 miles altitude. The photography was continuous and comprehensive. The strategic deception that had served Soviet interests since 1957 was about to collapse. Khrushchev could only hope American analysts would miss the evidence or interpret it incorrectly. The Corona program transformed intelligence gathering. Between 1960 and 1972, 145 Corona missions orbited Earth, returning more than 800,000 photographs. Coverage totaled approximately 750 million square miles. The satellites mapped Soviet military installations, industrial facilities, airfields, ports, and transportation networks. They monitored Chinese nuclear developments. They provided targeting information for American missiles. The photo interpreters who analyzed these images worked in obscurity, forbidden from discussing their work even with families. They developed techniques for measuring objects, identifying equipment, tracking construction progress, and estimating capabilities from shadows and infrastructure. Their work informed presidential briefings, arms control negotiations, and strategic planning. Arthur Lundahl, who had shown his team that first grainy photograph on August 19, 1960, later directed the National Photographic Interpretation Center from its creation in January 1961 until 1973. He briefed Presidents Eisenhower and Kennedy on Corona findings. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, his interpreters identified Soviet missiles in Cuba from U-2 photographs, providing the evidence that triggered 13 days of nuclear brinkmanship. In June 1973, Lundahl received the National Security Medal, the intelligence community's highest honor. The citation remained classified for decades, as did the details of his work. When he retired, few Americans knew his name or understood his contribution to national security. The Corona program itself remained classified until February 1995, when President Bill Clinton ordered the declassification of the early satellite imagery. The released photographs found unexpected uses. Archaeologists used them to locate ancient sites destroyed by later development. Environmental scientists tracked changes in forests, rivers, and coastlines. Geologists studied terrain features. The images provided a snapshot of Earth in the 1960s, before massive urbanization transformed the landscape. More than 860,000 images were transferred to the U.S. Geological Survey for public access. But the program's original purpose, exposing Soviet military deception, remains its most significant achievement. The missile gap controversy damaged American politics, distorted defense spending, and poisoned U.S.-Soviet relations. Kennedy's exploitation of the issue, despite being briefed on its falsity, contributed to Soviet paranoia about American intentions. Khrushchev believed Kennedy's aggressive rhetoric indicated plans for a first strike, a fear that intensified during the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Corona revelations also transformed arms control negotiations. When the United States and Soviet Union began discussing strategic arms limitations in the late 1960s, satellite reconnaissance provided the verification mechanism that made agreements possible. American negotiators knew they could monitor Soviet compliance through photography. This confidence enabled the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, signed in 1971. President Lyndon Johnson, speaking to a gathering in 1967, acknowledged the program's value in carefully worded remarks. He stated that even if nothing else had come from the space program, except knowledge gained from space photography, it would be worth 10 times the entire investment. The statement was public, but the specific reference to Corona remained classified. The men who built the Corona system worked under immense pressure and absolute secrecy. Lockheed served as prime contractor, integrating equipment from multiple sources. Engineers developed the Agena upper stage vehicle that housed the camera and return capsule. They created thermal protection systems to survive re-entry. They designed recovery mechanisms that could work in all weather conditions. They solved problems that had never been encountered before. The Air Force personnel who launched the satellites worked at Vandenberg, watching Thor Agena rockets lift into the California sky. The recovery crews, flying from Hickam Air Force Base in Hawaii, practiced snagging parachutes from moving aircraft. Navy ships cruised Pacific waters, ready to retrieve any capsule that splashed down. Film processing technicians developed thousands of feet of film under strict security protocols. None of them could discuss their work. Corona was code word classified, restricted to those with specific need to know. When Discoverer missions failed, public announcements attributed failures to scientific research problems. When missions succeeded, the Air Force released minimal information about recovering scientific data. The massive intelligence operation remained invisible to the American public and, more importantly, to the Soviet Union. The Soviets eventually learned about Corona through various intelligence channels, but the program's full capabilities remained uncertain. Moscow adapted its military infrastructure, moving sensitive installations underground and developing elaborate camouflage techniques. The Soviet space program launched its own reconnaissance satellites, the Zenit series, beginning in 1961. The space race had become, in part, a race to see who could photograph the other more effectively. For the United States, Corona provided strategic advantages that extended far beyond missile counting. The satellites monitored Soviet nuclear tests, tracked submarine construction, observed military exercises, and assessed economic capabilities. Intelligence analysts could see where the Soviets invested resources, revealing national priorities and strategic weaknesses. Each photograph contributed to a comprehensive understanding of Soviet capabilities and intentions. The intelligence community developed sophisticated analytical techniques specifically for Corona imagery. Specialists calculated precise measurements of objects using geometric principles. By photographing the same installation on multiple passes, analysts tracked construction progress and detected operational changes. Senior photo interpreters developed incredible expertise, learning to identify specific aircraft types, distinguish between weapon systems, and estimate operational readiness from positioning patterns. This comprehensive view of Soviet military power shaped American strategy for decades. Defense planners designed weapons systems to counter observed Soviet capabilities rather than imagined threats. Arms control negotiators understood exactly what they were negotiating about because satellites provided ground truth. The Cuban Missile Crisis demonstrated Corona's strategic value most dramatically. When President Kennedy faced the discovery of Soviet missiles in Cuba in October 1962, his advisors could compare Cuban installations with similar facilities photographed in the Soviet Union. Photo interpreters identified missile types, estimated ranges, and calculated how quickly the weapons could become operational. This precise intelligence enabled calibrated responses rather than panicked overreactions. Arthur Lundahl himself briefed Kennedy throughout the 13-day crisis. He brought enlarged photographs showing missile sites at San Cristobal and other Cuban locations. The president could see exactly what American intelligence knew and what remained uncertain. This transparency built confidence that decisions rested on facts rather than speculation. When the crisis ended peacefully, satellite reconnaissance deserved significant credit for providing the information that prevented catastrophic miscalculation. The program also demonstrated American technological prowess. Despite 13 consecutive failures, the engineers persevered until they achieved success. The same determination that produced the atomic bomb, radar, and proximity fuses now conquered the challenges of space reconnaissance. The achievement showed that American science and industry could solve seemingly impossible problems through systematic effort. The photo interpreters who discovered the missile gap's falsity understood they were witnessing history unfold through their stereoscopic viewers and magnifying glasses. Their analysis debunked one of the Cold War's most persistent myths through methodical, painstaking examination of thousands of images. They proved that Soviet boasts were hollow, that Khrushchev's claims of overwhelming missile superiority were propaganda, not reality. The truth, revealed through patient examination of satellite photographs, showed 4 operational missiles where hundreds had been claimed. These analysts worked in shifts around the clock at secure CIA facilities in Washington. Their workspace occupied secure spaces filled with light tables, stereoscopes, measuring equipment, and filing cabinets containing intelligence reports. Security was absolute. Guards checked identification at multiple checkpoints. Documents never left the building without authorization. Even waste paper was burned to prevent intelligence leaks. The interpreters came from diverse backgrounds. Many had served as aerial reconnaissance analysts during World War II and the Korean War. Others trained as geologists, geographers, or architects. All underwent months of specialized training in Soviet military equipment, construction techniques, and photographic interpretation principles. Their work combined art and science. Identifying a missile site required recognizing patterns that indicated military activity. Launch facilities needed specific infrastructure: roads, power lines, barracks, and storage facilities. Senior interpreters developed remarkable abilities to extract information from images, estimating building purposes from dimensions, identifying vehicles from shadows, and distinguishing operational facilities from construction sites. The search for Soviet missiles focused initially on known test ranges and suspected deployment areas. Tyuratam, later known as Baikonur Cosmodrome, received intensive scrutiny. Every Corona pass over central Kazakhstan produced images that interpreters examined for new construction, test stands, launch pads, and missile handling facilities. They documented the Soviet space program's growth while searching for ICBM deployments. Plesetsk in northwestern Russia became another focus area after signals intelligence suggested missile activity. When Corona finally photographed the region clearly, interpreters found the 4R-7 launch complexes. Each complex was unmistakable: massive concrete pads with gantry towers, fuel storage tanks, and support buildings. If hundreds of similar sites existed elsewhere, they would be equally obvious. The interpreters searched methodically across the entire Soviet Union, examining likely deployment regions with microscopic attention to detail. The systematic approach involved dividing Soviet territory into grids and examining each grid square for military installations. Interpreters checked areas near major cities that missiles would defend, regions close to western borders where missiles could threaten Europe, and remote zones where facilities might hide from detection. They examined terrain features, transportation networks, and population centers. If the Soviets had deployed even 50 missiles, Corona photography would have revealed supporting infrastructure. Month after month, the searches came up empty. Interpreters found bomber bases, tank divisions, naval facilities, and countless other military installations. But ICBM sites, supposedly numbering in the hundreds according to intelligence estimates, simply did not appear. Either Soviet camouflage had achieved impossible perfection, hiding massive complexes from orbital photography, or the missiles did not exist in claimed numbers. The analytical process included rigorous quality control. Multiple interpreters examined significant findings independently. Supervisors reviewed all conclusions before they entered intelligence reports. Specialists in Soviet military technology assessed whether identified installations matched expected characteristics. The system was designed to prevent both false positives and false negatives, ensuring accuracy while maintaining analytical speed. When interpreters identified an ambiguous installation, they requested follow-up photography on subsequent Corona missions. Tracking changes over time often clarified an installation's purpose. Construction progress indicated new facilities. Seasonal variations revealed agricultural versus military uses. Vehicle movements suggested operational versus storage sites. This temporal dimension added crucial information that single photographs could not provide. The interpreters also worked with signals intelligence analysts, human intelligence reports, and technical measurements from other collection systems. Combining multiple intelligence sources created a comprehensive picture of Soviet military capabilities. If signals intelligence detected missile test telemetry from a specific location, photo interpreters examined Corona imagery of that area for launch facilities. If defectors reported missile deployments near certain cities, photographs of those regions received extra scrutiny. By late 1960, the cumulative weight of negative findings became overwhelming. The CIA's photo interpreters had examined Corona imagery covering millions of square miles of Soviet territory. They had searched every likely deployment area multiple times. They had investigated hundreds of suspicious sites. And they had found only 4 operational ICBM launch complexes, precisely matching Khrushchev's actual rather than claimed capabilities. The interpreters documented their findings in detailed reports that circulated through the intelligence community. Each report included annotated photographs, precise measurements, confidence assessments, and supporting analysis. The reports were models of careful intelligence work, avoiding speculation while presenting facts that permitted only one conclusion. The missile gap was fiction. Soviet strategic missile forces numbered in the single digits, not the hundreds predicted by worst-case estimates. Robert McNamara, looking back decades later, acknowledged the missile gap as a myth created by emotionally guided but patriotic individuals. He recognized that corona photography had provided the definitive answer to questions that had plagued American defense planning for years. The satellites had done what spies and defectors could not, providing comprehensive proof of Soviet capabilities and limitations. The legacy of that first successful corona mission on August 18, 1960, extends to the present day. Every satellite reconnaissance system, from the high-resolution keyhole satellites to modern imaging spacecraft, traces its lineage to Discoverer 14. The techniques developed for corona, including stereophotography, automated processing, and systematic coverage, remain fundamental to intelligence gathering. In May 1995, the CIA held a symposium honoring corona veterans who had worked under secrecy for 30 years. Engineers, pilots, photo interpreters, and program managers finally could discuss their achievements publicly. Many brought families who had never known exactly what their loved ones did during the Cold War. The recognition came late, but the gratitude was genuine. The symposium featured displays of corona hardware, including cameras, film canisters, and return vehicles. Veterans shared stories of failures overcome, problems solved, and pressures endured. They spoke of watching launches from Vandenberg, of snagging capsules over the Pacific, of long nights examining photographs for any sign of Soviet missiles. They had spent years searching for threats that ultimately proved far smaller than feared. One participant, reflecting on the missile gap discovery, noted that corona had provided the most important negative intelligence in history. Proving what did not exist was just as valuable as discovering what did. The absence of hundreds of Soviet missiles changed everything. It meant the strategic balance favored America. It meant defense budgets could be based on reality rather than fear. It meant negotiation was possible from a position of strength. The first corona photograph, taken August 18, 1960, now resides in the National Archives. The grainy image shows Soviet territory stretching across the frame, forests and fields and rivers rendered in shades of grey. Somewhere in that vast landscape, photo interpreters searched for missiles that weren't there. The absence spoke louder than any presence could have. Arthur Lundahl held more than a photograph that August day in 1960. He held proof that would reshape the Cold War. The Soviet Union had lied about its military might. The missile gap was a myth, and a single satellite, after 13 failures, had revealed the truth that spies and defectors could never confirm. The age of satellite reconnaissance began with that grainy photograph and its stark revelation. The Soviets bragged about endless missiles. One satellite exposed the lie. The truth, captured from 100 miles above Earth and returned to the planet in a metal bucket, changed the course of history. America learned it held strategic advantage, not disadvantage. The missiles rolling off Soviet assembly lines like sausages existed primarily in Khrushchev's propaganda, not his arsenals. Corona taught an enduring lesson about intelligence, deception, and verification. Nations lie. Leaders exaggerate. Propaganda obscures reality. But photographs from space, analyzed by trained interpreters, reveal the truth. The missile gap's exposure demonstrated that American technology could overcome Soviet secrecy, that patient effort could succeed despite repeated failures, and that accurate information was worth more than confident assumptions. The program's success rested on the determination of people who refused to accept failure. After Discoverer 13 consecutive missions failed, they could have abandoned the effort. After Powers was shot down and the U-2 program ended, they could have despaired of ever seeing behind the Iron Curtain. After Khrushchev's boasts amplified American fears, they could have assumed the worst. Instead, they built a satellite, launched it into orbit, brought back its film, and changed the world. The photo interpreters who examined those first corona images understood they were making history. Each photograph they analyzed, each missile site they failed to find, Each empty field they documented was another piece of evidence. The cumulative weight of negative findings became undeniable proof. The missiles weren't there because they had never been built. The threat was exaggerated. The gap was fiction. This knowledge, hidden from the public for decades, guided American strategy through the most dangerous years of the Cold War. Presidents made decisions based on corona intelligence. Generals planned operations using corona photographs. Diplomats negotiated treaties verified by corona satellites. The program's contribution to national security exceeded even its creators' expectations. When the program finally ended on May 25, 1972, after 145 missions, it had revolutionized intelligence gathering. The technology evolved from simple panoramic cameras to sophisticated stereo systems. Resolution improved from 40 feet to 6 feet. Mission lengths extended from days to weeks, but the fundamental concept remained unchanged. Put a camera in orbit, photograph Soviet territory, return the film, and extract the truth. The Soviet Union eventually developed its own satellite reconnaissance capabilities, launching Zenit spacecraft that used similar film return technology. The competition drove improvements on both sides. But Corona's initial breakthrough, revealing the missile gap's falsity, gave America a strategic advantage that shaped the entire Cold War era. The men and women who created Corona, who launched it, who recovered its capsules, who analyzed its photographs, accomplished something remarkable. They proved that technology could overcome secrecy, that persistence could conquer failure, and that truth could dispel fear. They showed that one satellite could expose the lies of a superpower, and they demonstrated that in the information age, whoever sees clearly wins. The photograph Lundahl examined that August day, grainy and imperfect, proved more valuable than 1,000 spy reports. It showed the truth, and the truth, as it turned out, was that America's greatest fear rested on Soviet propaganda and Air Force overestimates. The missile gap existed only in imagination and politics, not in Soviet missile fields. One satellite had exposed the lie. The revelation changed everything, reshaping not just American defense policy, but the entire strategic calculus of the Cold War. The truth traveled through classified channels to the highest levels of government, altering assumptions that had driven policy for years. The immediate impact appeared in defense budgets and weapons procurement. Plans for massive ICBM buildups, justified by the need to match Soviet capabilities, underwent reassessment. The United States still expanded its missile forces, but at a measured pace driven by strategic requirements rather than panic over imagined Soviet superiority. The Minuteman missile program proceeded, but not with the crash urgency that missile gap fears had initially demanded. Strategic Air Command, which had planned on fighting a war against hundreds of Soviet missiles, revised its targeting lists and operational concepts. Bombers remained crucial to American nuclear strategy, but the threat they faced was different than anticipated. Soviet air defenses were formidable, but Soviet missile forces were not the overwhelming first strike capability that had haunted American military planners. The intelligence community itself underwent transformation. Corona's success validated technical intelligence collection over human intelligence in certain domains. While spies and defectors remained valuable, satellite reconnaissance provided comprehensive, reliable information that no spy network could match. The CIA's Directorate of Science and Technology gained prestige and resources. The National Reconnaissance Office, created in September 1961 to manage satellite programs, became one of America's most important intelligence organizations. The program established precedents for verification that would shape arms control negotiations for decades. When the United States and Soviet Union eventually agreed to limit strategic weapons, both sides understood that compliance could be monitored from space. National technical means became the diplomatic euphemism for satellite reconnaissance. Treaties specifically prohibited interfering with these national technical means, acknowledging their crucial role in maintaining international stability. The strategic arms limitation talks that began in November 1969 relied fundamentally on satellite verification. American negotiators knew they could detect new Soviet missile silos under construction, observe submarine launches, and count bombers at air bases. This confidence enabled agreements that would have been impossible without reliable verification methods. The Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty of 1972 and SALT I, agreement that same year, both depended on satellite reconnaissance to ensure compliance. Corona also influenced Soviet strategic thinking in unexpected ways. Moscow's awareness that American satellites monitored their territory led to changes in Soviet military procurement and deployment. Mobile missiles became priorities over fixed sites. Submarine-launched missiles received greater emphasis than land-based systems. The Soviets invested heavily in camouflage, deception, and concealment techniques. This action-reaction dynamic drove both sides toward more survivable strategic forces, arguably enhancing stability by reducing first-strike incentives. The technology developed for Corona spawned generations of increasingly sophisticated reconnaissance satellites. The KH-4 system, introduced in 1963, carried dual cameras for stereo photography. Resolution improved steadily, from 40 feet in early missions to 6 feet by the late 1960s. Mission durations extended from days to weeks as battery technology improved and spacecraft reliability increased. Later systems abandoned film return entirely, using electronic imaging that could transmit photographs directly to ground stations. But the fundamental principle remained unchanged. Put sensors in orbit, collect intelligence about adversary capabilities, and provide policymakers with accurate information for decision-making. Corona proved the concept worked, establishing satellite reconnaissance as a permanent feature of international relations. But Corona's greatest contribution remained its original purpose, exposing the missile gap myth through incontrovertible photographic evidence. The strategic deception that Nikita Khrushchev had maintained for 3 years collapsed when confronted with comprehensive orbital photography. Soviet claims of missile superiority crumbled when satellites revealed empty terrain where missile fields should have been. This exposure carried profound implications for understanding Soviet behavior. Khrushchev's belligerence, his threats and boasts, stemmed from weakness rather than strength. The shoe-pounding at the United Nations, the claims about missile mass production, the brinksmanship over Berlin, all represented attempts to compensate for genuine inferiority through psychological intimidation. When the bluff was called, Soviet strategic options narrowed dramatically. The Cuban Missile Crisis of October 1962 must be understood in this context. Khrushchev's decision to place medium-range missiles in Cuba stemmed partly from his awareness that the strategic balance heavily favored the United States. The missiles in Cuba were an attempt to redress the imbalance quickly and cheaply. Corona satellites had revealed Soviet weakness. Soviet missiles in Cuba were the response. Corona satellites then photographed those missiles, enabling Kennedy's calibrated response that ended the crisis peacefully. The program demonstrated that persistence overcomes failure when supported by sound engineering and adequate resources. 13 consecutive mission failures could have killed Corona, but the engineers learned from each failure, modified designs, tested solutions, and tried again. When Discoverer 14 finally succeeded, all the previous failures became stepping stones rather than defeats. This lesson about technological perseverance influenced later American space programs, from Apollo to the Space Shuttle to Mars exploration. The men and women who made Corona possible worked in obscurity for decades, forbidden from discussing their achievements even with loved ones. Engineers who solved unprecedented technical problems could not publish papers describing their innovations. Pilots who snagged capsules from the sky could not share flying stories with fellow aviators. Photo interpreters who exposed the missile gap myth could not tell their spouses what they had discovered. The secrecy was necessary but costly, denying recognition to people who had contributed fundamentally to national security. When the program finally emerged from classification in the 1990s, many Corona veterans were elderly or deceased. The 1995 symposium provided long overdue recognition, but the delay meant some contributors never received public acknowledgement for their work. This remains a recurring challenge for intelligence programs, balancing security requirements against the human need for recognition. Arthur Lundahl, who examined that first photograph on August 19, 1960, symbolizes the countless individuals whose expertise made Corona successful. His career in photographic interpretation began in World War II, analyzing reconnaissance images from bombing missions over Europe. He brought that experience to the CIA, building the National Photographic Interpretation Center into the world's premier image analysis organization. His briefings to presidents during crises demonstrated how intelligence, when properly analyzed and clearly presented, enables effective decision-making. The satellite that changed everything was Discoverer 14, also known by its classified designation Corona 9009. The spacecraft weighed approximately 810 kilograms fully loaded. It orbited between 160 and 210 miles altitude. It completed 17 orbits during its operational mission, and it returned 20 pounds of film containing the most consequential negative intelligence in history. That negative intelligence, proving what did not exist, was worth more than discovering what did. Finding Soviet missiles would have confirmed fears and driven larger defense budgets. Finding no missiles where hundreds were claimed revealed that American strategy rested on false assumptions. The correction prevented wasted resources and misguided policies. The value of this truth exceeded calculation. The Corona program cost approximately $1 billion across 12 years, measured in dollars of that era. The intelligence return justified this investment many times over. Every satellite mission, every recovered capsule, every analyzed photograph contributed to comprehensive understanding of Soviet capabilities. This knowledge prevented wars, enabled arms control, supported crisis management, and allowed strategic planning based on reality rather than speculation. The final Corona mission launched May 25, 1972. The capsule was recovered May 31st, bringing the program to a close after 145 missions. Follow-on systems with higher resolution and more sophisticated sensors continued the work, but Corona had proven the concept and established the foundation. Everything that followed built on those first grainy photographs that showed empty land where missiles should have been. Looking back across more than 60 years, Corona stands as one of the Cold War's decisive technological achievements, not because it revolutionized military capabilities, though the intelligence it provided certainly influenced defense programs. Not because it demonstrated American technical prowess, though it certainly did that, but because it revealed truth in an era of deception, providing facts when speculation dominated, showing reality when propaganda prevailed. The Soviets bragged about endless missiles. One satellite exposed the lie. And that exposure, through the simple act of photographing Earth from space, changed the course of the 20th century. The missile gap existed only in estimates and political rhetoric, not in Soviet missile fields. 4 ICBMs was the truth, hundreds was the fiction. Corona showed which was which. Arthur Lundahl's trembling hands that August morning held more than film and photographs. They held proof that technology could defeat deception, that patient effort could overcome repeated failure, and that truth revealed through objective observation could reshape international relations. The Cold War was ultimately won, not through military superiority alone, but through information dominance. Corona provided that information when it mattered most, exposing the gap between Soviet claims and Soviet capabilities. The legacy endures in every reconnaissance satellite orbiting Earth today, in arms control treaties verified from space, in crisis management enabled by overhead photography, and in the fundamental understanding that observation from orbit provides strategic advantages impossible to achieve through any other means. From Corona's first grainy images to modern satellites that can read license plates from space, the lineage is direct and unbroken. One satellite exposed the lie. The truth changed everything.